Okay, so I think unless we have any further technical issues, we'll make a start. Great. So today's speaker is Dr. Sophie Cooper, who has just recently joined us at Queen's as a lecturer in liberal arts. Sophie holds her PhD from the University of Edinburgh, and she's a social and cultural historian focusing on Irish migrant communities living in the United States and Australia during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Her monograph, Forging Identities in the Irish World, Melbourne and Chicago, circa 1830 to 1922, is forthcoming with Edinburgh University Press. It should be out in February of next year, Sophie? Yeah, so February 2022. Her doctoral work used education, religion, civic nationalism, sport, and Irish nationalism to explore the ways that immigrant and second generation identities were influenced, shaped, and adapted within these two cities. And her postdoctoral research builds upon some of these themes, focusing on religious orders and Irish identity in the diaspora. And this work increasingly considers the agency and impact of migrant women in public spaces, including in Manchester and Limerick. So it's a great pleasure to have Sophie with us this afternoon. Hopefully you should be able to see her presentation on screen. If you can't see that, please, if you're online, let me know. Just shout out and say. If you can, as you can see, the title of Sophie's presentation today is In Harmony with the People of the Parish, Working Towards a Multi-Generational Irish Community in 19th Century Melbourne and Chicago. So Sophie, great pleasure. I hand over to you. You can have the microphone.
Thank you.
And camera.
I think it needs to go into presentation mode as well. Yeah,
oh, yeah, there
seems to have worked.
Great. Okay, so over to you.
Thank you so much. So hello, and thank you to Peter for inviting me to speak here this afternoon, and for everyone coming along either here or online. So a lot of what I'll be speaking about today comes from my forthcoming book, which I'm basically just putting everywhere so that everyone knows that it's coming out. It's now available for pre-order if you wish. So a lot of what I'm speaking about today will come from this book. And my work is chiefly concerned with how Irish communities encouraged and sustained a collective sense of connection to an idea of Ireland in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Where James Barrett has written of Americanization of ethnic society from the bottom up, I consider the ways that different groups in Melbourne and Chicago society competed and collaborated to sustain a strong sense of Irish ethnic community and belonging. I'm chiefly concerned with the evolution of Irish identities, those predicated on religion, class, gender, within Melbourne and Chicago, and the ways that individuals engaged with ideas of belonging to a global Irish nation in personal and group contexts. So today I want to consider one of the key arguments in the book, that to create and sustain a multi-generational ethnic identity, you need the influences of both men and women, and both conscious and unconscious influences and articulations of identity. The distinctive influences of women and men, religious and lay, on Irish community life and identity formation in the US and Australia has yet to be, well, hasn't been examined in tandem until now. So we need to bring women in from the peripheries of St. Patrick's Day balls, the attics of domestic servitude, and the silent donors to nationalist subscriber lists. These are all important positions. However, they don't fully acknowledge the role of Irish women throughout society in shaping Irish community life, from the roots upwards, creating a cultural affinity for children in schools and in the family home, which in turn could be built upon by male leaders. Jennifer Redmond notes that, while very important, many studies of Irish migrants continue to ignore women's specific experiences while claiming to be books about Irish migrants, not books about Irish men, which indeed they are. My work places children and women alongside men to understand how Irish migrants and their children reached adulthood already ensconced in a network of friendships, associations, and memory, which intertwined religion, ethnicity, and class. My argument is that the cultural affinity, which was so key in developing a collective sense of ethnic identity, was promoted by surrounding Irish-born and descended children with teachers, nuns, priests, and employers who sounded like their parents. This affinity was more than a passing engagement with Irishness. Instead, Irish heritage, and for most, Catholic religion, but not for everyone, became a foundational identity that could be built upon by articulations of Irish or American or Australian nationality. This could be actively ignored, and it was by some. However, for many, it provided an often unconscious identity through which all other interactions with host or immigrant society were viewed through. So I found Avtar Bra's concept of diaspora spaces particularly useful in exploring ethnic identity. Bra reminds us that we need to consider migrant identity as being shaped by both internal and external community influences. The local context in which people of Irish birth and descent established a place for themselves and reconfigured their priorities with regard to ethnic and religious identities are central to the identities which emerge. So let us look at the cities themselves, Melbourne and Chicago. The mid-19th century signalled the advent of a new type of city, cities without a long history, which benefited from an immediate prioritisation of industry and industriousness, or shop cities, to use Bath's term. Melbourne and Chicago had their roots in the land expansionism of the 1830s and developed rapidly at the same time as Ireland's rural and Catholic population began to emigrate in large numbers. In the middle of the decade of the 19th century, Chicago's population, as you can see here, increased 2.5 times in one decade, and Melbourne's increased fourfold. As this huge expansion of European settlers occurred, the indigenous landholders were pushed out by treaty and through violence. Ethnic communities, their churches and institutions, and their fight for public space had long-term and temporary impacts on the shape of each city. The urban space provided particular opportunities for ethnic communities to perform their identities and the power that they wielded through parades, spectacle, and physical brick and mortar. So studying the cities as they developed across almost a century allows for the consideration of the role of Irish people in shaping the cities as labourers, architects of social progress, as well as by being politicians and fundraisers. Now, despite the large disparity in absolute numbers of Irish people arriving in the US and Australia, the US received most Irish migrants, Australia not very many. Melbourne and Chicago attracted remarkably similar proportions of Irish immigrants until the 1880s. So I suppose here you can see that the pattern is very similar until the 1880s. The really kind of key element, which justifies my comparison, is the Irish-born as percentage of Melbourne's population and Chicago's population. As you can see here, 19.8, 20.3 in 1850. This stays within more or less a percentage point of each other well until the 1890s. So even though the cities are growing at huge, completely different rates, I suppose, the percentage of Irish people with Irish-born people within this stays more or less the same. And this is largely because, by the 1890s, we still have a lot of Irish people going to both Chicago and Melbourne, but they are becoming a much smaller proportion of the total population, partly because of just natural increase in these places, which is something I'll come back to, but also because you have, by the 1890s, kind of new migrant groups, Southern Europeans in both places, but in the US, especially from kind of the turn of the century, you've got a lot more Eastern Europeans and African Americans moving from the South, the so-called Great Migration. So the Irish-born contingent of both cities is decreasing, which means that bringing in Irish-descended people into this Irish community becomes more and more important in both cities. So Irish immigration in the aftermath of the famine was, as we all know, a unique European emigration, with Irish women emigrating in the same numbers as men, more or less. In the second half of the 19th century, 1.9 million men and 1.8 million women emigrated from Ireland. By the 20th century, higher numbers of women were leaving Ireland than men. Changes in land ownership patterns in Ireland led to a decrease in status for women, particularly those without dowries, and therefore a rise in single women. Faced with increased chances of dependence on older siblings or the convent, Irish women left to find jobs, and to a lesser extent, husbands abroad. This equity in numbers meant that a tight-knit Irish community was created, connected to Ireland, or at least the idea of Ireland, and to fellow Irish people. This connection was relatively easy in 1850, at the beginning of large-scale Catholic migration from Ireland. The superintendent of the US federal census that year observed that these closer Irish communities led many Irish parents to report their American-born children as natives of Ireland. So, according to the census enumerator, foreigners associate so exclusively together and are socially so generally separated from the natives for a long time that their feelings of alienship are inseparably connected with their families and their children, as well as with themselves. And they do not always discriminate between locality of birth, parentage, blood, origin, even religion. And sometimes they merge all into one class, calling all Irish, etc., who are sons of Irish soil, because they have a common blood, origin, or religion. Now, obviously, we've got to take into account there's a nice bit of, anti-Irishness kind of stereotyping there. But it's also interesting when we're thinking about community ties, how close, the idea of Irish ghettoization in urban areas is quite famous. Actually, in Chicago and Melbourne, we find that Irish people are living all across the cities. There are areas where there are more Irish people, but this tends to be on industry as opposed to this kind of real need to be in a close community. But as the distance from this first mass migration became more distant, new generations of Irish teachers, lay or religious, enabled and encouraged ethnic mirroring within parish schools, subliminally creating an intergenerational cultural affinity to Ireland. And this is why I think tracking over kind of 90 years is key for me. So we're seeing how this kind of engagement with Irishness shifts. So the concept of ethnic or social mirroring comes from sociological scholarship on interracial and intercultural relations, particularly in the US. According to this scholarship, led largely by Sean Wiley, Crystal Perkins, and Kay Doe, while migrant generations often form their identities within a frame of reference based in their country of origin, later generations form their identities in relation to positive or negative images of their ethnic group. So while nuns and teachers may have been terrifying in their own ways, they also held positions of societal and religious authority and respect. They were positive role models, and they were both men and women. And these people were key in helping second and third generation Irish descended children and young adults make that conscious or unconscious choice to identify with an island that for many of them only existed in the stories of their parents and grandparents. And this continued outside of the parish into the public school systems, where as native English speakers, opportunities continued for Irish Catholics as the 19th century drew to a close. Outside of official schooling, children attended neighbourhood clubs with the children of other Irish immigrants, where they were taught by Irish or Irish descended teachers. The similar numbers of Irish men and women, both Melbourne and Chicago, during and in the aftermath of the famine, enabled the creation of multi-generational Irish communities abroad, where Irish men and women could marry each other and raise families while retaining their Irishness. Ethnic identification was a process influenced by culture brokers, which is John Belcham's term, families and through ascription from others. Kathleen Niels-Conzen and colleagues argue that ethnicity is not a collective fiction, but rather a process of construction or invention which incorporates, adapts, and amplifies pre-existing communal solidarities, cultural attributes, and historical memories. So, if this kind of shared collective memory is a defining feature of a diasporic consciousness, it's vital to explore how this sense of being Irish was constructed, represented and internalized by Irish migrants across, as many generations as possible. In 1854, the average age of Melbourne's population was 24 and a half, while 4 years earlier, 3/4 of Cook County's population were under the age of 30. As mentioned, for the Irish community, this youthful population was also relatively equal in terms of gender. This, rather unsurprisingly, led to an explosion in the numbers of school-aged children in the 1860s. During that decade, the number of boys in Victoria under the age of 14 increased at 10 times the rate of boys and men over that age. Therefore, while the population of Victoria increased by 1/3 in the decade after 1861, the numbers attending school trebled. Likewise, in Cook County, the children of school age jumped from 19% of the total population to 27% between 1860 and 70. And this would have important impacts on who we should consider culture brokers, traditionally the politicians, publicans, and priests, in these Irish diasporic communities. While priests in the immigrant church have been described by James McCartin as neighbourhood chieftains, religious sisters, who were apparently subordinate to priests, were spiritual authorities of immense significance for the children in their classrooms and objects of reverent respect in the larger community. For this reason, bishops in both Melbourne and Chicago worked with their counterparts in Ireland to bring out Irish religious orders to staff their Catholic parishes, particularly those who catered to Irish migrant groups. In Melbourne, to be Irish didn't mean that you were necessarily Catholic, but for most of the time period that I cover, to be Catholic was to be Irish. In Chicago, an ethnic parish system was established in 1844, meaning that Irish Catholics went to school, church, school, and parish associations only with other Irish Catholics. German Catholics did the same, often with German religious orders and learning in German, and similar for other groups. So there was an explicit emphasis on matching religious orders to the ethnic backgrounds of their congregants. Parish school systems and the Irish religious orders that frequently staffed them were fundamental to this foundational identity creation, often unconscious, but vital to giving children a sense of location and belonging. Cara DeLay and Kathleen Sprouse-Cummings have emphasised the ways that Irish Catholic women worked within and in tension with institutional frameworks of religion and respectability to shape a particularly feminine understanding of Irish Catholicism. My work takes a similar approach, considering both the explicit and implicit influences on identities traditionally considered to be led by men. Maureen Fitzgerald's work on Irish Catholic nuns in New York argues that convents, in her words, became a primary means through which working class Irish Catholic women gained public power. Moreover, convents provided the Irish Catholic working class with the means to articulate and make manifest its political agendas and social vision. Women religious, as women who have taken religious vows are collectively known, have in traditional approaches to 19th century life been rendered invisible by dominant Protestant and secular narratives of progress, their own vows of humility and obedience, and by the vocalness of their male counterparts. And while Irish Catholic nuns in Melbourne and Chicago were unable to wield the same power as Tammany Hall-backed New Yorkers, the women religious of these cities built and retained power on their charges and congregants. So this is a bit of the census return from 1880, and it's for the Chicago's Lake Avenue St. Joseph's Orphan Asylum. On that night, there were 232 children resident. As the census enumerator's kind of comment shows, most of them did not know who their parents were or what their parents' nativity was. Most, according to the census enumerator, had been found in the street at a young age with few identifying details. Despite this, most had Irish names. Kate McCormick and Maggie Comerford played alongside Nellie Mulligan and Bridget O'Connell, and Eugene Hannafin slept beside Michael Dennehy and Willie Powers. The entire adult population of the orphanage was from Ireland. 13 sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet, 2 male servants, and 1 elderly priest. These Chicago children had Irish names, were raised by Irish people, and presumably continued on to be part of Irish communities in adulthood. Similar could be expected of the children who attended Immaculate Conception School on North Franklin Street, where 5 of the 6 sisters of St. Dominic were born in Ireland or had Irish parents, or those attending St. Joseph's School on Emerald Avenue, where this was true for all 7 sisters. These were Catholic and Irish institutions, transferred abroad, and once there altered the growing Irish community in ways that might not be immediately recognised. Religious-run schools and institutions created a structure for parish life, and through the incorporation of confirmation classes and sodalities, the religious life of children continued into adulthood, taking and expanding the bonds of friendship, loyalty, and identity across generations. Children were also included in the creation of an urban identity, which connected city pride with Irish identity. The St. Patrick's Society Hall, which in the 1851 was the largest hall in Melbourne, became the temporary home of the Victorian Parliament in 1851, immediately connecting the political, social and economic hopes of Victoria to the existing financial and territorial successes of its Irish citizens. A year before, news of the passage of the Australian Colonies Bill filled the streets of the burgeoning city of Melbourne with 4 days of celebrations. When the city's leading citizens paraded, they were joined by an estimated 6,000 children. The city's newspapers explicitly mentioned that these children were from the city's Catholic schools, who assembled their students and took part in the parade alongside the St. Patrick's Society with its banners of St. Patrick on the Hill of Tara, the Harp of Erin, and the Victorian Separation banner. Further down the parade lines was the Father Matthew Temperance Society. The city's main newspaper, the Argus, remarked that the appearance of the children was, in their words, creditable to their parents and full of promise to the future of Victoria. Now remember that only Catholic children are mentioned, which is really interesting considering that the Argus usually took quite a negative approach to Catholicism. As Simon Slater has demonstrated, young city dwellers were increasingly called forward to promote and validate a number of causes by performing in public. And while Slate focuses on the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Irish communities in Melbourne began to include their young people in the performance of civic pride during the middle of the century. Young people in Melbourne and Chicago were specifically targeted as the future holders of urban identity and pride, and claiming Irishness within that was a key strategy for the leaders of associational culture, educational institutions, and religious organisations. And as religious orders established more schools and homes for students, working children and orphans, juvenile bands were established in parish schools, uniting younger generations with their older co-parishioners to march and parade as part of the parish. The specific city context influenced the appearance and styling of these bands and youth groups. For example, the Emerald Cadets of the Holy Family Parish in Chicago, who, according to the parish historian, dressed in tight-fitting green jackets, black trousers, brown leather belts and caps of military type, such as the soldiers of 61 were. They were equipped with real muskets, which, considering how young those children look, is a little alarming. While older boys could join the Emerald Cadets in a slight nod to health and safety, younger students were encouraged to join the Crusaders, who only drilled with tin swords. These cadet units showed religious and ethnic loyalty to the US and harked back to the Irish Brigades of the Civil War, performing identity in a similar way to the ethnic militias that paraded on St. Patrick's Day, while reminding others of Irish Catholic sacrifice in the US Civil War. St. Patrick's Day also provided opportunities to get school children involved. In 1873, for example, the celebration at Chicago's Holy Family School brought 350 children together from 4 parochial schools in the parish. According to the Western Catholic Reporter, the tableau was the crowning feature of the evening. The first tableau was based on the scriptural history of Joseph and his brothers in the book of Genesis. This proved the scriptural education and training of the children. Their Catholic education was acknowledged. The second tableau provided their training in Irish history and the nationalist edge of that education. It was a descriptive of the Wexford massacre and was divided into 3 parts: praying around the cross, the massacre, and after the massacre. So the priorities of the next generation of Irish Chicagoans was clear. These were to be the adults who would become involved in Irish nationalist activities in the city in the 1880s. A similar emphasis on Irish nationalism of some sort or another can be seen in Melbourne schools. In August 1882, members of the Children of Mary Sodality at St. Peter's and St. Paul's School in Emerald Hill concluded their 12 months of prayer for the peace and prosperity of Ireland with a general communion and procession. Branches of this sodality throughout Melbourne and wider Victoria had brought 4,000 monthly communicants from Melbourne's convents, the Christian Brothers, and all the children and pupils under their care together for a monthly mass. In 1918, this nationalist thinking was brought into the St. Patrick's Day celebrations when Catholic groups carried Sinn Féin colours and flags, and the school's display at the exhibition gardens included a display by the children attending Sisters of Mercy schools, who formed a living shamrock, symbolic of Rome, Erin, and Australia, with the papal, Australian, and crucially the Sinn Féin flags flying. The parishioners of the Sisters of Good Samaritan also carried a Sinn Féin flag bordered in black for the dead rebels of Ireland. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, children were explicitly included in multi-generational expressions of ethnic and religious community identity. This was key to sustaining organisations like the St. Patrick's Society, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and latterly trade unions with high Irish contingents who claimed to speak on behalf of each city's Irish communities. Organisations which, by the turn of the 20th century, were led by both Irish-descended men and women. So as the 19th century progressed, girls increasingly outnumbered boys among those enrolled in Ireland's national schools. And these women filled the schools of Melbourne and Chicago as teachers, nuns, and mothers, hoping for similar educational opportunities for their children. While increasing numbers of women religious arrived from Ireland, the established communities were joined by local girls who had benefited from their educational influence. The reputation of the sisters in improving the lives of each city's poor encouraged new postulants, as did the routinized behaviour of convent school life. There was the added bonus that using religious orders as staff kept the diocese costs down. They could run the parish schools with limited funds because they only had to pay for women religious's room and board. They didn't need to worry about unions or pay or the nuns getting married and then being left short-staffed. These women and their Irish background influenced the communities that they ministered to, both in their spiritual and their ethnic identity. And they were also cheap, which I think was probably the winning bit. Irish religious orders, lay teachers and volunteers from organisations such as the St. Vincent de Paul Society staffed day, boarding and Sunday schools, further linking the representatives of ethnicity and religion, Irish and Catholic, with the wider parish community in both Melbourne and Chicago. The connections made in the schoolyard and latterly throughout parish organisations made for powerful networks which could be utilised in both Irish and Catholic life. The quotation included in the title of the paper comes from the St. James's Parish in Chicago. Established in 1855, members of this parish had close familial and civil links with the Sisters of Mercy's St. Agatha's Academy and Mercy Hospital, providing the parishioners with influential connections. In 1883, after the parishioners heard that they might not get the priest that they hoped for, they travelled up Wabash Avenue to Archbishop Fian's house to request a meeting. Finding Fian out, they left a respectful but direct letter, suggesting that if they couldn't appoint their own choice, Father D.J. Reardon, Fian should appoint some other good and zealous priest who would be in harmony with the people of the parish. The men who signed this letter included prominent and wealthy businessmen like Michael and John Cudahy, as well as bookseller Bernard Callahan and labourer Dennis O'Connell. These men demonstrate the overlapping religious, ethnic, business and nationalist concerns of Irish Chicago. Michael Cudahy, John Guerin and Bernard Callahan, for example, attended an 1879 anti-rent gathering supporting Irish land reform. Guerin, a doctor, was also the chairman of the Chicago Committee for the Irish National League Convention in 1886, a committee that included 4 of the 16 St. James's Parish letter signatories. The connections of these men in just one of Chicago's Catholic parishes illustrates some of the ways that parishioners' lives crossed over on religious, national and geographical issues. With these priorities, it's clear that the desire for harmony with the parish related to the wish for an Irish priest to reflect the Irish makeup of the parish. The men didn't get their way on Reardon this time. They were actually trying to poach him from St. Elizabeth Parish to replace his brother Patrick, when Patrick was consecrated as the assistant to the Bishop of San Francisco, and he'd later become the Archbishop of San Francisco. So the Reardon brothers were very much part of the Chicago family. They'd been educated in the nearby St. Mary of the Lake Seminary in Chicago, and they also went to Notre Dame in nearby South Bend. Archbishop Fian did appoint another Irishman, though, Hugh Maguire, who joined a parish run by fellow Irishmen. As you can see from this census, they're all from Ireland or are descended or have Irish parentage, right down to the servants. Everyone in the house is Irish or Irish descended. The choice of an Irishman, however, didn't guarantee agreement, even within one household. Maguire became embroiled in a series of battles with both his subordinate priests and parishioners over the next 10 years, largely around their Irishness. In 1892, it was revealed that he'd removed one of his assistants for being part of the Newman Society, which Maguire branded that Clan na Gael organisation. He complained about another of his assistants, Father McCann, for being part of the Irish Ring. In a city where the Archbishop frequently hosted the leaders of Clan na Gael, a militant nationalist organisation, Maguire was an outlier, and it seems that Chicago priests did all that they could do in the 1890s to hinder his career. Despite this, Maguire remained the pastor for another decade into the 1910s, perhaps due to his apparent popularity with the rich elements of his congregation, a time recalled as the golden era of St. James's Parish by the parish historian. As I mentioned, the congregation of St. James's dated from 1855. The first baby to be baptised on May 27th that year was William Whelan, while the first marriage officiated by Father Thomas Kelly was between Michael Egan and Catherine Driscoll. This parish, which would later become central to Bronzeville in the early 20th century, it became one of Chicago's first integrated Catholic churches, had its roots in a thoroughly Irish community. Its parishioners were part of what Ellen Scarrett calls brick and mortar Catholicism. The foundation stone of a new grand church building was laid in 1875, being consecrated in 1880 and opened in 1883. Designed by Patrick Keeley, a prolific Catholic church architect, this church was a declaration of Irish Catholic power and wealth. In the words of Scarrett, much more than mere places of worship and education, these parish complexes proclaimed in a very visible way that the Irish were becoming devout urban dwellers. And I'd argue that helping to facilitate all of this were women. In 1855, for example, the lady teachers and pupils of St. Agatha's Academy presented the new bishop, Anthony O'Regan of County Mayo, with $100 in gold to aid in building his house. Similarly, in 1859, the lay members of the Holy Family Parish donated $1,004 within 10 weeks for stained glass windows. and many women were among the names of the subscribers. I remember, like, Chicago is a growing city here. These are mainly famine migrants. This isn't a wealthy community at this stage. I mean, Chicago gets very wealthy after during the Civil War, but in the 1850s, this is still a growing community. It's still a poor community. So the fact that they're donating this amount of money is quite impressive. So Ellen Skerritt has argued that churches and schools became important symbols of respectability and commitment for the Irish Catholics who first established parishes in Chicago. And so these subscriber lists are really important to seeing how they are kind of claiming space. Similar fundraising activities, particularly around schooling, can be seen in Melbourne, with women at the helm of fundraising committees and organising bazaars for a range of institutions. And it's also interesting to note that female religious orders facilitated the expansion of provision across different orders. In Melbourne, for example, the Sisters of Mercy, the first Catholic religious order, male or female, to arrive in the city in 1857, provided accommodation for the Irish Sisters of Good Shepherd in 1863 when they arrived, until fundraising allowed for the purchase of Abbotsford Convent, which I'll come back to in a moment. In return, the Good Shepherds took over the running of institutions that more closely aligned with their charism. While this was largely about Catholic belonging and presence, the interdependence of religious and ethnic identities and institutions meant that there were a lot of crossovers between the two. When Irish and Irish descended women fundraised to build a new convent, they were doing it for Catholicism, but they were also helping to house women from Ireland who were establishing a mission to help or minister to Irish communities. And the specific challenges of urban life led to an influx of Irish religious orders to save women and children who were deemed to be penitent through the establishment of Magdalene laundries and workshops. Abbotsford Convent, established by the Good Shepherd Sisters, was one such religious complex. And you can see it here. The Good Shepherds focused their efforts on so-called fallen women, which became a great source of curiosity by Melbourne's middle classes, who viewed their work with approval. The convent estate held a Magdalene laundry, an orphanage, and 2 schools, one for the orphans and poor, and another for the children of middle-class Catholics. They used needlework and lace making as tools for their work, reforming women who had fallen on hard times. In addition to learning new skills, these women and girls were helping the process of devotional practice emerge and continue in the Australian colonies. The women based at Abbotsford and similar convents were engaged in needlework, making the vestments of new generations of priests and the finery that bedecked the newly built Catholic churches in the colonies. They were therefore contributing to the spread of a spiritual empire in the mould of the Irish Catholic Church. The women in Abbotsford made Limerick lace veils, like the one on the left, a tool that women, religious and lay women, used to connect themselves to Ireland, to the Catholic Church, and to their Irish Australian Catholic schooling, through the wearing of lace, particularly lace veils at weddings and other kind of big events well into the 1940s. So to return to Bra's idea of diaspora spaces, both the urban environment and the shifting ethnic and religious environments required specific responses from the church and from the Irish community, both in Ireland and abroad. The personnel and political connections available to each community across different generations meant that engagement with diasporic identity and how culture brokers brought new generations into that community had to adapt and develop. In 1903, the Hibernian Australasian Catholic Benevolent Society, for example, passed a motion to offer practical encouragement for the teaching of Irish history in Melbourne schools, including essay prizes for students going to public schools. In 1909, Irish history was taught in 26 of Chicago's parish schools after a kind of concerted campaign by the Archbishop. So the raising of Irish descended children with a structural emphasis on Irishness continued. So to conclude, I think we need to expand our understanding of the archive to consider conscious and unconscious articulations of ethnic and religious identity, and to look beyond our typical assumptions about culture brokers. Through the use of material culture methodologies, through incorporating work on the history of emotions to explore effective experiences of faith or community, or by looking at the histories of education for a better understanding of the role of parish schools and ethnic mirroring, informing friendships and aspiration. By examining who actually fundraised and coordinated things behind the scenes, those people whose names didn't make it into the list of speakers at a ball, or were only mentioned for their fashion choices. Ethnic identity or cultural affinity didn't just jump out of a cape when a man turned 15 or 18, when they started work or went to a pub or a club. It started way before that, in the family home, in the schoolyard, playing in the street, or at church. Parental involvement was obviously really important, but so were the friendships that you made, partly through the choice or necessity of attending a parish school with other Irish and Irish descended children. The parish school forced community cooperation, and the parish school had women at its centre. By bringing together these different strands of research, we can move away from immigrant history that are actually just about men, and how men articulated their experience or hope for ethnic communities, and construct a fuller understanding of how ethnic identity and cultural affinity grew, sustained, and evolved over multiple generations. By including women and children in the story and the differing ways that they influenced ethnic identity, articulation, and performance, we can begin to gain a fuller understanding of the myriad influences on multi-generational ethnic identity in a variety of local and national contexts. Thank you very much.
Sophie, thank you so much for that wonderful paper. Let's see if we can get you back on camera, and we can then move to our Q&A.